Well, I don't know what you've been up to for the last year as we have been sheltering in place, but I, for one, have been painting my house. Yes, painting my entire house. I have painted the entire exterior of the house, which is, saying something because it involves a 20-foot ladder. The driveway has a 60-foot pitch on it. So that meant I had to put several bricks under one of the legs of that ladder. I had to crawl to the top of the ladder with a paint can in one hand and a paintbrush in the other. And it was all fine until my neighbor walked past and said, "Hey, Pastor Graham." And they expected me to wave. I don't think Pastor Graham likes me. He's not waving at me. It was a bit scary, but I got through it. But when I wasn't painting the outside of the house, I was painting the basement of the house. Now, you may have heard a sermon a long time ago when I talked about beginning in one corner of the basement. And by the way, a shout out to my wonderful wife, Star, who has dealt with her husband painting in the basement for the last year. She has wondered at times whether I am not like the doppelganger of like Jack Nicholson in the movie The Shining, like all work and no play makes Graham a dull boy. She's been fine as long as I keep it in the basement. So I began about 1 year ago, and I began by painting one of the doors in the house in the basement, and it is kind of this burgundy color, kind of pretty. But then I got another color, and I decided to paint that kind of this aqua blue color on one side, and then a white pillar on the other. Again, I'm just kind of putting paints together. And then on one shelf, our workout little center down there, I have these teal colored shelves. And then yet in another side, I have like a white background. And then finally, I have this evergreen color on another. And the thing is, none of these colors go together, like at all. A color wheel would not have these colors on them. They are totally crazy. And yet somewhere in my heart, these colors kind of come together. They kind of make sense. They kind of are a part of my soul. And then I realized what I had done. I had painted our basement in the Baird family tartan. This is the Baird tartan, the Baird plaid. So if you come from a Scottish or an Irish background, you know what a tartan or a plaid is, but there you can see the purple and the teal and the blue. And what I realized is that somewhere deep inside of me, in a place that I could not even access cognitively, I had the Baird family tartan that goes back like 300 years in my family. And then I painted the basement in this crazy array of colors, and it came out this last year during the COVID crisis. But that leads me to my first point today, and that is that all of us have these complex things. We have complex stuff inside of us. And like me, some of your complex stuff is going to be cultural stuff. So maybe you don't come from Scotland or Ireland. Maybe you come from like India or China or Korea or Taiwan. And we say a shout out to our Taiwanese friends who have had another crisis of 50 people on a train who just died this weekend. Maybe you come from France, or maybe you come from some other part of the world. That is a part of what is inside of you. The other thing that we have inside of us are our thoughts. Now, I have said a few times now that I've had a hard time actually putting a thought together during this COVID crisis. But actually, that's not true. What I realize is that I have way too many thoughts going on in my brain, and they are colliding with one another, like semiconductors. And what I realized, what I read recently, is that our human brain manufactures, that is your brain and mine, 4,000 random thoughts every single minute. That's right. Every single minute, there are these random thoughts, disconnected, that are firing in our brains. So this is about 30 minutes into this message today, and so that means that today, you, during this service, have had 120,000 independent thoughts. You're thinking about your Easter brunch. You're thinking about your mask, whether it's washed. You're thinking about whether it fits. You're thinking about whether your kids are going to be quarantined. You're thinking about all kinds of things, and we are thinking about fears more than ever in our lives right now. They are colliding into one another. Now, that's just 30 minutes. In 240,000 independent thoughts you will have at the end of this service, and by the end of this day, there will be 5.7 million random thoughts going on in your brain. So that's my first point on this Easter Sunday. All of us have complex things happening inside. Some of the things that are happening in our hearts are not just thoughts or cultural backgrounds, but they are dark things. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. We talked about how all of us are like sheep. We wander. All people wander. All of us have bad stuff inside of us. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that as I watched the television screen of the trial that was taking place in Minneapolis for George Floyd, I watched with a deep sense of utter revulsion at the images that I saw. Absolute revulsion. Now, I want to be real careful about what I say here because I want to lift up the brave and courageous and good men and women of our police forces who are doing great work in our country today. Thank you for all you do. And I also don't want to make a big social sweeping statement today. It is Easter, but we will be making some of those statements as the weeks advance. But what I saw on that television was a sense of indifference to another person's life, of utter nonchalance about taking another person's life, of disengagement from another person's pain. And when one person takes another person's life, in our tradition, that is an inviolable sin because a life is not ours to take because God made that life. So, all of us have dark things in our lives, and we continue to pray for that trial up there in Minneapolis. So we have cultural things going on in our heads. We have thoughts going on in our heads. We have bad stuff. But on this Easter Sunday, what I really want to ask is, how do we get this cross into our hearts? How can this not just be a symbol that we have on our buildings and around our necks and on statues like this? How can we get this cross into our hearts to take the place of those other things? Well, it's quite funny. There are lots of funny examples of people trying to get the cross into their life. I'll never forget when I first got ordained in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There was this pastor friend who came into my office and he was just elated. He had passed the ordination exams to become a pastor. I said, "Congratulations." He said, "I decided to get myself a gift." I said, that's wonderful. Did you decide to get yourself like a Bible or, like a robe or something? He said, "No, I got myself a tattoo." I said, "Wow, that's great. Did you get like a Hebrew letter or like a scripture verse?" He said, "No, I decided to go like big." He said, this is a true story, I decided to get a tattoo of the Presbyterian Church USA's cross on my back." And I was like, wow. Do you ever, whenever someone says something you don't exactly know what to say, wow. He then took off his shirt, and yes, my friends, from his neck to his base of his back to each side is this massive Presbyterian cross. And I was like, wow. And then I asked, but what if you change denominations? So we all try to get the cross of Christ into our lives in various ways. But before we ask the question of how do we get the cross into our lives, into our hearts, we might begin by just saying, what is the cross? What is Easter Sunday? And it is at least 4 big things. This is what the cross means. The cross is the greatest expression of love in the history of the world. There have been millions of people who have professed love for one another, people who have gotten down on bended knee and asked that person into their lives. There have been millions of soldiers on battlefields who gave up their lives for other people. There have been millions of expressions of love. But on that Easter was the greatest expression of love in the history of the world. When Jesus went up to that cross, he did it because he loves us. The other thing that it is, the cross, it's the greatest expression of forgiveness. Now again, there have been countless people through the years who have said those words, I am sorry. And by the way, those are the three most important words for a marriage, and not I love you. They are I am sorry. And the other three important words in any marriage are I forgive you. There have been millions of times when people asked for forgiveness and received it, but when Jesus went upon that cross, there has never been a greater example of forgiveness, of God taking all of the bad stuff in our lives upon that cross. I love the words of David Crowder, that great worship song. He said, you came for criminals and every Pharisee. You came for hypocrites, even one like me. So number one, it was the greatest expression of love. Number two, the greatest expression of forgiveness. Number three, the greatest expression of sacrifice, of one person doing something sacrificial for another. And again, the world is full of parents who have sacrificed for kids, of grandparents who have sacrificed for grandkids. The world is full of immigrants who have sacrificed to get to the border of a country. The world is full of sacrifice. And yet, that Easter, when Jesus went on that cross, it was the greatest example of sacrifice ever. And finally, and most importantly, on this Easter, and this is what we need more than ever, it was the greatest expression of hope the world has ever known. You see, the cross was an implement of shame. It was where criminals went. It was the lowest form of criminal execution you could find in the Roman Empire. It was a place of shame. Philip Yancey said that Jesus was actually the first of the three to die. The other two criminals watched as Jesus' body hung there on the cross. And yet, what happened on that Easter is that Jesus took that implement of shame and he transformed it forever into an implement of hope. So that anytime anybody sees or has a cross in their life, they also have hope. So it's those four things: love, forgiveness, sacrifice, hope. But how do we get the cross into our hearts? I want to talk about that in a minute, but before I do, I want to say that you know that someone has the cross of Christ in their hearts without knowing anything about their life. You can always tell when someone has the cross in their hearts. One incredible example of this happened actually 1 year ago, April 21st, 2020. A 48-year-old dad by the name of Sivad Johnson was out walking with his daughter in Detroit along the edge of the Great Belle Isle, the Great Waterway. When he looked down into the waterway, he saw these three little girls struggling. They were in the water flailing, and without even thinking, Sivad Johnson took off his belt, he jumped over the railing, he swam out to save those girls. He saved all three little girls, and yet he gave up his life on that day. If you want to hear more about Sivad Johnson, listen to the Moth Radio Hour talk in 2018. He gave an incredible talk, To Bravely Do or To Bravely Die. We will never know everything about Sivad Johnson, but I can tell you one thing. Sivad Johnson had the cross of Christ at the very center of his life. You always know because it comes out of a person's life. What's on the inside always comes out. Another powerful example of the cross of Christ in a person's heart happened not too long ago from a doctor named Dr. Samuel Weinstein. Now, this incredible individual serves as the chief cardiothoracic of surgery for Children's Hospital in Montefiore Medical Center in New York. That's a mouthful. But when Dr. Weinstein was on a recent mission trip to El Salvador, He is operating on a little boy who has a heart condition named Francisco Calderon Anthony Fernandez. He's only 8 years old. He had been operating on this little boy for 10 hours when he was still not saving the little boy's life. At that point, they began to run out of blood for transfusion. And this little boy had a very rare form of blood known as B negative, which is only 2% of the population. Now, it just so happened that Dr. Samuel Weinstein has the B negative blood type, so he asked the nurses to take over and the surgery as he went and drew a couple of pints of blood. He then had a Pop-Tart and rested for about 20 minutes, and then he went over to the operating table, and he began to operate on that little boy's body. Now just think about this. The blood of the surgeon was now in the little boy's body, and he saved Francisco Calderon Anthony Fernandez's life. I don't know everything about Samuel Weinstein, but I do know this. The cross of Christ was in his heart. Now, I want to tell you how you get the cross of Christ in your heart, but I want to tell you one thing first. As I was in the basement this last year, painting away, I was listening to a podcast of a real-life saint named Saint Cuthbert. Now, Saint Cuthbert lived in the 600s, and he lived in the northeast of England on a beautiful place called Lindisfarne, or Holy Island. Saint Cuthbert was not just a monk and a hermit and a bishop, but he was a holy man. Miracles took place when Saint Cuthbert came in to a space. The great historian Bede once said of Cuthbert that he was good in thought, word, and deed. He was an athletic person, and he was a miracle man, and he actually stopped some storms in his life, and he saved many people through healings. He was a saint. But then on March 20th, 687 AD, St. Cuthbert died. He died, and he was placed into a coffin, and a great stone was put on top of it, but beforehand, linen was wrapped around St. Cuthbert's body, and an incredible cross was placed on St. Cuthbert's chest. And this is the exact cross placed on Cuthbert's chest. Now, the reason that this cross was placed on his chest was because of an ancient Celtic creed of the Celtic monks. And that is that all Christ followers must bear the cross of Christ in their breast. So they put him in the tomb. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, scientists in northeastern England decided to unearth the body of St. Cuthbert. And inside they found a miraculous thing. They found that the body of St. Cuthbert had not changed at all in 500 years. It was almost totally preserved, like he had just been laid into the grave, except for one thing, a great mystery and a great miracle. They couldn't find the cross. They searched all around this coffin, but they could not find the cross of St. Cuthbert. They did an X-ray on the body, and there, right next to Cuthbert's heart, they found the cross of Christ. Now, you may not believe that, but I do. I believe in miracles like that. That the cross of Christ was inside of Cuthbert. But how do you and I get the cross of Christ in our lives? Well, number one, we don't need to be a saint. Number two, we don't have to have everything figured out. Number three, we don't have to be buried with an incredible gold cross upon our chest. How do we get the love of the cross, the forgiveness of the cross, the sacrifice of the cross, the hope of the cross into our hearts so that at random moments the cross comes out? One way, we ask for it. And you may have asked for the cross of Christ to be in your hearts before, but Today, I want to invite everybody watching, everybody worshiping with me, to just say this prayer along with me and ask that the cross of Christ on this Easter Sunday be inside of us. Dear God, on this Easter Sunday in the year 2021, I want to ask that you would place your cross in all of our hearts. All of us have a myriad of things in us. Some are good, some are bad, some are just confusing. But aside all of those things, we ask that your cross would be in our hearts, so that we have your love, and we have your sacrifice and your forgiveness, and we have your hope, and most of all, Lord, on this Easter, we have your life, now and forevermore. In the name of the cross, in Jesus' name, amen.